The 13th Warrior has a ghost problem. And look, I know what you're thinking. The 13th Warrior has ghosts in it? No, it doesn't, and that's the problem. I'm Everday, and at the end of this video, I will be grading the 13th Warrior on its folklorical accuracy. Along the way, we'll explore how the film reimagines the Beowulf saga for a non-supernatural world. And we'll get to the bottom of my biggest beef. Why did the film set up the idea of Mylingar, or child spirits, but never pay it off, despite having two perfect opportunities to do so? Let's take a look. The 1999 John McTiernan directed 13th Warrior began its narrative life as a book, Michael Crichton's 1976 novel, Eaters of the Dead. To quote Crichton, "I wrote Eaters of the Dead on a bet that I could make an entertaining story out of Beowulf." Having read the book, I'd say mission accomplished. Although, to be fair, Beowulf was already pretty entertaining as far as Old English epic poems go, and writer Burton Raffel made it accessible to the masses with his 1963 modern-sounding translation. Putting Crichton's book and commentary aside, the Beowulf references in the 13th Warrior are readily apparent. For starters, there are the names. The blonde-haired leader of the Viking crew is named not Beowulf, but Bullewif. They switched the L from the second part of the name to the first. Meanwhile, King Hrothgar is the same, ditto Queen Wyleu, albeit with a simplified spelling. The king and queen's seat of power, the Mead Hall Heret, is the same. One of the 13 warriors bears Beowulf's father's name, Edgardo. Another is named for Beowulf's uncle, the Geatish king, Hygelak. A more controversial choice was to name King Hrothgar's scheming son after Wiglaf, who in the saga is actually Beowulf's most loyal thane. I think the idea here was to have Wiglaf be a dark reflection of Bullewif, like how Belloc is a dark reflection of Indiana Jones and Raiders. Both men are born with status, yet the former hides behind that status, while the latter proves himself worthy of it again and again through acts of bravery. Hence, the king calls for Bullewif's aid when attacked by the creatures that shall not be named. Or at least at the beginning of the film, people don't say the name, but once they break the seal, everybody's saying it.
The Wendol.
The Wendol are the bearskin-clad cannibals who, much like the Beowulf saga's man-eating monster Grendel, have a nasty habit of terrorizing Heret Hall. And I have a strong suspicion that the name Wendol came about by taking the second half of Grendel and tacking it on to the first half of the name Wendigo. The Wendigo being an evil spirit or supernatural creature from Algonquin folklore known for its gluttony and tendency to eat humans. Algonquin-speaking peoples lived, amongst other places, along the northeastern coast of North America, making them the perfect geographic choice for some folkloric crossover with ancient Nordic peoples, who we know made it to the Americas at least once prior to that guy Christopher's trip across the pond. And I'd be remiss not to mention that in modern depictions, the Wendigo almost always has horns or antlers, which may help explain the origin of the Wendel military leader's horns of power. The horns might also be a nod to Cernunnos from Gaulish Celtic mythology. He's sort of become the poster boy for modern paganism. And what is the Beowulf saga, and by extension the 13th Warrior, if not an allegorical depiction of the power of monotheism overcoming the last vestiges of pagan power? The movie puts an even more interesting spin on this idea by making our POV character, Antonio Banderas' Ahmed ibn Fadlan ibn al-Abbas ibn Rashid Ahmed, a Muslim. Whereas the original saga, while rooted in pagan mythology, is heavily Christianized in its preserved form, which isn't much of a surprise given that it was first written down by an Anglo-Saxon Christian poet. A poet who went so far as to refer to the ancient Danish religious practices of making sacrifices and speaking vows as, quote, hoping for hell's support, the devil's guidance. And who, dare I ask, was responsible for bringing such a strong Christian viewpoint to these Anglo-Saxons who were formerly pagan themselves? The Irish. Hence the high crosses with their Hiberno-Saxon knotwork, commonly known as Celtic knotwork, and hence the Beowulf saga. Or should I say the Tonbo Freyek, or Cattle Raid of Freyek. Because there is a case to be made that this old Irish myth, which features a hero entering a dark lake and facing off against a dragon/serpent, inspired the Old English saga, Beowulf. Fun fact, in the original Irish version of the Tonbo Fraic, the word used for dragon was Péist, which translates literally to worm. And similarly, in Beowulf, the dragon is often referred to as a Wyrm, which was the forerunner to the modern English word worm. And now it makes sense why, when the villagers are like, hey, there's a glowworm coming, Antonio Banderas' character, the master of language comprehension that he is immediately like, oh, you mean a dragon? By the way, in case you were curious why this work of historical fiction seemingly stretched the bounds of historical accuracy in order to have an Arabic diplomat from Baghdad meet up with a bunch of Vikings, well, the thing is, that actually happened. Ahmad ibn Fadlan was a real dude, who in the 10th century traveled to what is now Russia and stayed at an encampment along the Volga River. And who was staying right nearby? The aptly named Volga Vikings, aka the Rus, who had originally come from Sweden. But enough about history. I'm here for the folklore, including creepy spirit kids. It's such a small detail introduced at the beginning of the film, but it really helps set the tone. Herger the Joyous explains to Ahmed that the reason the boy stands on the bow of the ship like a statue is to let the Vikings see him, because it's possible the boy could be a spirit. So by standing there, he's letting the Vikings see that he is in fact a real boy. And it turns out this was a real concern, at least among the superstitious. Because in Scandinavian folklore, Mylingar, singular Milling, are the ghosts of children whose mothers didn't want them, so they... yikes. So now the Mylingar roam the earth, demanding proper burials, or sometimes just names. To achieve the former, they've been known to hop on the backs of travelers and force said travelers to carry them to graveyards. Only the Mylingar get heavier as they get closer to graveyards, and sometimes the piggyback givers can't complete their journeys, which results in the little child spirits, well, yikes again. It's such an unsettling bit of lore to introduce at the beginning of a film. And on rewatch, I realized that seeing a lone child out in the open somewhere is a recurring motif in the 13th Warrior. After our hero's journey to the north, we get that lone survivor from an earlier off-screen raid coming down the hillside. And in the second half of the film, just as our heroes have completed barricading the hall, we get another lone child coming down the hillside, prompting Ahmed ibn Fadlan ibn al-Abbas ibn Rashid ibn Hamid to get on his horse, jump the barricade, and go rescue her. But wouldn't it have been cooler if, when our man got on his horse, Herger the Joyous was like, hey, where the heck are you going? And Ahmed ibn Fadlan was like, you don't see her? And Herger's like, no, it's not real! But he goes anyway, and the whole point should have been that he's being lured out by this evil spirit, and he should have listened to Herger's advice from before and respected their lore. And maybe he figures that out at the last second and turns back just as a spear flies by his head, or maybe the evil child spirit jumps on his back and tries to kill him. The twist, of course, is that this is not a literal ghost or spirit, it's just a wicked spooky kid, maybe even one of the village's kids who has been kidnapped and brainwashed. Don't call it a rewrite, call it fulfilling the principle of Chekhov's milling. Although, come to think of it, we could interpret the girl being swooped up and carried by our hero as a symbolic representation of a milling receiving its salvation. In which case, what have I been complaining about? We've got bigger fish people to fry, by which I mean Grendel's mother. But let's do this in order. The Beowulf saga features 3 primary antagonists, all of whom have equivalents in the 1999 movie, The 13th Warrior. There's Grendel, represented in the film by the Wendol, Grendel's mother, represented by the Wendol mother, and the dragon, represented by the glowworm or fire serpent. Let's start with our boy Grendel, and here is the introduction he gets in the Beowulf saga. Quote, Hrothgar's men lived happy in his hall, till the monster stirred, that demon, that fiend Grendel, who haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in a hell, not hell, but earth. He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures banished by God. End quote. Sounds like a nice guy. And right off the flattened Viking sword, we've got an allusion to Grendel living in the earth, which is exactly what we see with the cave-dwelling Wendol. As for what type of monster Grendel is, the anonymous Anglo-Saxon poet who recorded the Beowulf saga employed 2 distinct terms. Fierce, meaning giant or demon, and Jotun, which basically means the same thing, giant. Although it should be noted that etymologically, Jotun comes from the Proto-Germanic etunas, which translates literally to eater, but can also mean a giant overeater or glutton. Marvel fans and Norse mythology fans, what's up, will know that the trickster god Loki is famously part Jotun, or frost giant, as they say in the MCU. But to the best of my recollection, Loki doesn't eat anyone, whereas Grendel is a glutton for human flesh. Although if you want to get technical, it seems like he's more of a marrow guy. To quote Beowulf himself, "I think if my time will have come, there'll be nothing to mourn over, no corpse to prepare for its grave. Grendel will carry our bloody flesh to the moors, crunch on our bones, and smear torn scraps of our skin on the walls of his den." End quote. This disturbing imagery, and even some of the language, is replicated in the scene where Antonio Banderas's Ahmad ibn Fadlan ibn al-Abbas ibn Rashid ibn Hamid goes into the hut, sees the gory devastation caused by the Wendol, and reports they have been gnawed upon. Now, adapting a single giant man-eating monster into a bloodthirsty horde of humans, or Neanderthals if you prefer, makes sense if your aim is to do a grounded take on Beowulf. Because in the poem, Grendel snatches and smashes to death 30 dudes in one night and drags their bodies back to his subterranean lair. The movie has a similar scene, and showing the Wendol carrying away the heads of their victims, mimicking Grendel carrying away the bodies, is a nice, well, not nice, touch. Of course, the Wendol are also keen to carry away their own dead, and now I understand why. From a filmmaking perspective at least. You need to have the Grendel gets his arm ripped off scene. It's a major turning point in the Beowulf saga. But when your Grendel is a Wendol, i.e. a group of human-sized monsters comprising the whole, a few of their corpses being left behind serves as the equivalent of Beowulf scoring himself a giant Grendel arm. Because once they can see these bodies up close, our warriors are able to know for sure that these bear-clad man-eating monsters are humans. Or just about. Which brings us to Grendel's mother, and her 13th warrior equivalent, the Wendol mother. In the Beowulf saga, Grendel's mother is described as a merewif, literally a water woman. It's like a mermaid, only witchier. We're not talking full Ursula here though, she doesn't have tentacles. Anyway, having the movie's Beowulf equivalent Beowulf pass through the water to reach the mother in her subterranean sanctuary is spot on, as is having the mother attack Beowulf first. To quote the saga, she welcomed him in her claws, clutched at him savagely but could not harm him, tried to work her fingers through the tight ring-woven mail on his breast, but tore and scratched in vain. End quote. Of course, in the movie, we see the mother figure successfully wield a claw against our hero, and we all know what happens next. Both Grendel's mother and the Wendol mother lose their heads. As for the figurine of the Wendol mother and that sculpture of her we see in the cave, those are great touches. The exaggerated imagery here, evoking fertility, harkens back to a belief system from 30,000 years ago, a time when a divine mother or fertility goddess may have been at the center of spiritual life. And if you're wondering how I came up with that 30,000 year date, that's how old the so-called Venus of Willendorf is, which is a real artifact discovered in what is now Austria that the filmmakers turned to for design inspiration. For the record, the Venus of Willendorf isn't actually a representation of the Greco-Roman goddess Venus, because Greco-Roman mythology didn't exist 30,000 years ago. It's just a name archaeologists use for ancient figures that look like this. Finally, we have the dragon from Beowulf, which in the 13th Warrior turns out to be Calvary. Flaming cavalry, I should say, because all of the mounted Wendol carry torches. That was another smart choice, because if you're trying to come up with a real-world equivalent of a giant fire-breathing monster capable of wreaking the type of havoc the Beowulf dragon wreaks, and believe me, that thing reeks, your options are limited. To quote the saga, vomiting fire and smoke, the dragon burned down their homes. They watched in horror as the flames rose up. The angry monster meant to leave nothing alive, and the signs of its anger flickered and glowed in the darkness, visible for miles, tokens of its hate and its cruelty, spread like a warning to the Geats who had broken its rest. End quote. I mean, come on, the movie for sure succeeded in capturing that imagery. That being said, historically the use of cavalry didn't become popularized in Denmark until the 12th century, and it wouldn't be adopted in Sweden until the 13th century. Meanwhile, this movie is set in the 10th century. But, and this is a two-cheeked but, cheek A, horse domestication and horse riding developed independently on the Eurasian steppes. Incidentally, it was along the Volga River where the most successful domestication practices were pioneered around 4,000 years ago. My point being, it's not impossible that the Wendol, this isolated tribe, came up with horse domestication independently. And what's even more likely is that they stole some domesticated horses and bred them. But this brings me to cheek B, which is, I don't care so much about historical accuracy. What I'm interested in is folklorical accuracy. And given everything we've looked at in this video, I feel it within my bones. And my bones that may one day be crunched upon, or gnawed upon, by man-eating monsters, that the 13th Warrior deserves an A+. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment Ahmed Ebn Fadlan Ebn Al-Abbas Ebn Rashid Ebn Hamed. If you want to vote on the topic of my next video, make sure you are subscribed to the Folklore and Film channel and that notifications are turned on. As always, my name is I.E. Neverday, editor of the Celtic fantasy short story anthology Neon Druid. Thanks for coming out.